Good afternoon, I'm Yannis Ioannidis. Of course, we're running out of time always, so let me very briefly introduce our panel members. Immediately to my left is Mr. Kontogiannis. He studied economics and finance. He had a distinguished career in banking, and he's currently in the shipping business, consulting, managing out of London. To the left of Mr. Kontogiannis is John Lipsky. John Lipsky has a PhD in economics from Stanford. He has had a distinguished career as an international civil servant, first at the IMF, then in banking and finance, rising to chief economist of Salomon Brothers. Then on to JP Morgan Chase, ultimately, where again he rose up to be chief economist. And finally, most recently, he served as first deputy managing director of the IMF from 2006 to 2011. And in fact, during that period, he also served as acting managing director before Christine Lagarde was appointed. So now he's with SAIS at Johns Hopkins University. Two more panelists. Ms. Kefalogianni, Olga Kefalogyanni, is a lawyer, and in fact a Fletcher alum, I believe, yes. And she has been a member of the Greek Parliament since 2007, with the New Democracy Party. And in fact, she served as Minister of Tourism during the Samaras, well, actually it was the coalition government of New Democracy and PASOK, 2012 to 2014, with the portfolio of Minister of Tourism. And finally, to her left is Lukas Tsoukalis, a professor in the University of Athens, a professor of a Europeanist, political scientist, and political economist, has written extensively on issues of economic integration in Europe, political economy. And without further ado, let me start by opening the panel. And I'd like to ask John Lipsky to lead the discussion by broaching issues of, by the way, let me remind everyone that the difficulty here on this panel is we have to look forward. And we learn from the past, but also look forward. So, John, if you can please broach the issues of how the assistance that Greece received from the international community is helping Greece right now moving forward, issues of banking, international banking, and to the extent that maybe you can briefly broach the issue of Brexit and how that might affect Greece moving forward.
Cool. Simple questions. Thank you. Thanks, Yanni. And allow me to add my congratulations to the organizers of what have been an excellent conference so far, and thank them for the invitation. First, in looking forward, I think it's worth first thinking about what the broad economic environment is likely to be over the next year or so, in the context in which, if we look at the latest IMF World Economic Outlook that was released just a couple of weeks ago, and look at what the performance anticipated for the Greek economy is over the next year plus, it's actually the forecast, as it was, I think, Lucas Papadimos mentioned, is a favorable one. After registering a slight decline last year, the WEO forecast for Greece is essentially flat, 0.1% growth this year, but an acceleration to 2.8% next year. That presupposes, I think, as Lucas pointed out, the successful implementation of the program in all its aspects. But it's also worth looking at what is the surrounding environment going to be for for the Greek economy in the coming year if the fund's forecast is correct. And that is a relatively modest one. As you may be aware, the fund is forecasting growth this year of 3.1% and next year 3.4%. But when we look at the advanced economies, that's including a growth rate of 1.6% this year, 1.8% next year. In other words, what the fund is saying is that the advanced economies are growing at a pace lower than the 20 or 30-year average. And in fact, if we look over a broader span, you would say that there was a substantial drop in GDP in the advanced economies, of course, in 2008, 2009, and that gap has never been made up by subsequent above-trend growth, leading to a lot of uncertainty about how much excess capacity exists in the advanced economies right now. An easy historical view would suggest that there must be substantial excess capacity, except investment, especially business investment in the advanced economies, has been lower than the long-term average, thus creating another source of uncertainty about how much capacity there is. When we look at the Eurozone, the fund is suggesting growth of 1.7% this year, but 1.5% next year. And what this means, and certainly one of the sources, the significant sources of problems for Greece, not just for Greece, is that when you look at the performance of the European Union, the Euro economy, in not just a growth context overall, which is shown since the end of 2007, the European economy will have grown about a little over 4%. But when you take that in per capita terms, per capita output in the European economy is just now getting back to where it was in 2007. So one of the sources of grumpiness, if you will, in the challenges for the European Union is a performance on a per capita basis substantially weaker than the other major advanced economies. The fund is also suggesting trade volume growth this year that will remain slower than the level of the growth of world GDP. Another challenge for prospects for Greece and elsewhere that want to look towards increased or improved export performance as a source of growth. This continues the pattern that has existed since the crisis began in 2008 of global trade growth slower than the growth of the overall economy. This reverses essentially 60 years in which trade growth has led growth internationally. Now, the fund is anticipating that will finally come to an end next year. They anticipate 3.8% growth in trade volumes against GDP of 3.4%, but that's still historically a very weak performance. Bottom line here, and I should stop and let the other panelists talk, the immediate outlook for the global economy, and especially surrounding Greece, is not a terribly upbeat one. It's a continued modest one. I took a look back for interest. We've heard a lot of talk about the initial 2010 program to see what the world economy looked like at that time. And in October 2010, the IMF was anticipating global growth of around 4.5%, and European growth about as strong as now. In other words, at a time, what the fund is saying, and in answer to your question, that the Greek program, despite weaker growth in the rest of the world and no better growth in Europe, is actually going to be associated with better performance of the Greek economy than was the case in 2010 and 11, when the rest of the world was performing better.
Thank you very much, John, for a very lucid and on-the-point presentation. Let me turn to Lukas Tsoukalis. The European side is extremely important. The EU, the Eurozone, the position of Greece, with the feelings of the Greek citizens vis-à-vis the assistance that has been given. And finally, this latest development, there is clearly a factor, Brexit, the vote, what it might mean for progress of European integration and, of course, progress within the Eurozone itself. So,
okay, thank you very much. We've already heard much about the economic situation, and I'm not sure I have so much to add. But let me tell you in my own words what looks to me like the story we have experienced and the lessons we have learned or not learned. Remember that Greece lived for several years beyond its means. And when the international financial bubble burst, it was clear that Greece had to go through a long and painful adjustment. It had to be long and painful because Greece had a terrible combination of a very large current account deficit, a very large budget deficit, and on top of that, a credibility deficit, because our European partners and the rest of the world discovered that we had been, perhaps all too frequently, economical with the truth and creative in the use of statistics. So, and on top of that, Greece had to go through this adjustment under the constraints of membership in a currency union. What we have discovered, with the benefit of hindsight, is that adjustment has been much longer and much more painful than anybody had anticipated. And we have to try to understand very briefly the reasons for that in order to draw lessons for the future. Of course, one problem has to do with how Greece's European partners and creditors dealt with the Greek problem. And it also has to do with how Greece, its political class, and society responded to that. Greece, I believe, in 2010 was a country that was not illiquid, but it was insolvent. And many people in the IMF thought the same. And that's why they were extremely skeptical in engaging the IMF with the first adjustment program. Greece's European partners decided otherwise because declaring insolvency and therefore drawing conclusions about the restructuring of the debt would have consequences for the European banking system, and most of the European partners were not prepared to do that. On top of that, Greece's European partners imposed a totally unrealistic and punishing program, not only in terms of the size and speed of fiscal adjustment, but also a wide-ranging program of structural reform that had very little in terms of prioritizing inside it, and suffered from lack of political realism. And on top of all those things, much of Greece's political class and Greece's society remained for long in a state of denial about the kind of things that the country required in order to return to growth and to restore healthy public finances. The result of all that, and I think Greece is going to be a case study to be studied in several universities around the world about what should not be done in such cases, both from the creditor side and also from the country concerned. Now, the result has been an implosion of the economy, which was followed very quickly by an implosion of the political system. Have we learned lessons from the experience, a pretty awful experience, of the first two adjustment programs? I'm not so sure that the lessons we have learned are enough. Remember that the Greek public debt remains unsustainable. There is, in principle, an agreement to write off part of the debt, but the attitude of Greece's partners as regards Greek sovereign debt reminds me of the famous saying of St. Augustine, God give me virtue, but not yet. And not yet keeps on being repeated year after year. We've been hearing about it since 2012. On top of it, Greece's creditors have imposed through the third adjustment program a fiscal adjustment which is politically and economically unrealistic. I mean, to ask a country that, for reasons largely of its own, right, of its own fault, has lost 26% of its GDP, to run primary surpluses of 3.5% of GDP for 10 years is beyond the order, not only realism, it's beyond imagination. And it's clearly economically and politically not sustainable. And on top of it, now you have in Greece a government that is being asked to implement a program. Most of the members of the government do not believe in that program and therefore apply it at best in an incoherent and often inconsistent manner. And my conclusion is that in Greece today, there is a very serious credibility gap of the government vis-à-vis not only Greece's creditors, but also Greece's potential foreign investors. And as long as this gap is not dealt with somehow, I'm not sure that the prospects for the Greek economy will be good.
Thank you. Let me turn now to Όλγα Κεφαλογιάννη. It would be very interesting for our conference if you can broach issues for what is really affecting what's really Greece's, one of Greece's most important industries, tourism. You've had the portfolio of tourism. And please put this in a more broader context as we look forward, given the politics, but given the reality of what tourism, really means, how can we move forward, improve the quality of the product. But I don't want to put words in your mouth.
So thank you very much. Before going to tourism, let me first say that it's great to be back at Fletcher 10 years after my graduation. I was a GMAP student, and it was a great transition between my previous job as a lawyer and going into politics. What is really interesting is what I learned here at Fletcher and how it really comes to mind being an active politician. And I believe my mentor, Diane Shigas, is somewhere here in the room. She taught us international negotiations. And Diane came to my mind very often, together with what she taught us, when the first 6 months of 2015, with the negotiating team of Greece, headed by then Finance Minister, Mr. Varoufakis, I believe led Greece into one of the worst negotiations ever to be registered in the world record. And not only was it a very bad negotiation process, it also led to what Mr. Chouliarakis just said was the inevitable third memorandum. New Democracy supported the government back in summer 2015 with this third memorandum, although we believe that it was not inevitable. And I really need to remind the audience that 2014, after 6 years of recession, the Greek economy started growing. So it was up by 0.7%. So this was something that has to be registered because Mr. Chouliarakis just said before that 2015, we only had a marginal recession of 0.2%. It was 0.5%, but today the official number is 0.2%, and that this shows the resilience of the Greek economy. But in reality, the IMF had predicted a 2.9% growth. So we have to compare our situation, as it were, in 2014 and what happened after the new government, the Syriza-NL government, took office. And if we have to go back to the four elements of the Greek crisis, one is the fiscal dimension, the deficit and the huge debt. I would like to remind the audience that the Samaras administration managed to deliver a primary surplus, and that while Mr. Papadimos was the prime minister, we had the largest debt restructure with the haircut. The second level of the crisis was the lack of competitiveness, and we saw that by 2014 we had gained our competitiveness. Not that we were where we should have been, but at least we had gained 10 points in the global competitiveness index of the World Economic Forum, and we're back 5 positions down now in 2016. The financial and banking crisis was also the other level, and the recapitalization of the banks was already successful by end of 2014. There was the need for a new recapitalization of the banks in 2015 because of the protracted negotiations and what happened in the first half of 2015. And the last element was the political level. We saw that the challenges of the traditional political parties were huge. Political stability is actually the most important element for any discussion that we may have as to what next for the Greek economy. And we had political stability back in 2014, the first 6 months of 2014, but the instability came back because of the Syriza party then asking for elections and actually overthrowing the Samaras government. And actually that was because I really hate populism, and being a member of the New Democracy Party, I cannot not remember that the Syriza party, just before the elections of January 2015, had a program which was unrealistic, it was populist, and it was full of false promises that they did not deliver on. In any case, if we have to see what's next for the Greek economy, I believe that there are elements of political stability, of bringing back confidence to the Greek economy and the Greek government, which are important. And of course, national consensus is important. And my party will definitely act in a very serious and effective way in terms of trying at least to satisfy this need for a national unity for the future of the Greek economy. Now, for the priorities that we have to set, I believe that first of all, we have to have a national strategic plan for our economic growth. And I have to stress the word national plan. This is something that we have not delivered yet, and we have to remind ourselves that Greece has operated for many years with an economic model, a growth model, which was based on overborrowing and the consumption of imported goods. So we definitely need a national strategic plan that will make our economy much more competitive and extrovert. We need to be able to attract investment. We have been suffering by disinvestment. We definitely need to have our exports amount to a larger part of our GDP, and there enter the sectors of the Greek economy where we have the competitive advantages, let's say. One of them is tourism, of course, culture, energy. I believe that energy is important also for the geopolitical and geostrategic role of Greece. Agriculture, both in terms of production and also processing. Pharmaceuticals, new technologies, combined transportation, logistics, and of course shipping. And in order to attract investment in all these sectors, I believe that it's also important for Greek entrepreneurs to invest in our country. And we see that it's very often that foreign investors team up with local partners for investments in Greece. We have seen this in various tourism projects. We have seen this in the very successful privatization of the regional airports, where a big German company, Fraport, teamed up with a Greek entrepreneur in order to operate the regional airports. So this is an element which is important. So reforms and privatizations, we have been discussing a lot about reforms. The privatization program and the use of the public real estate properties imperative in order to be able to see the way forward. And of course, I would not agree with Minister Chouliarakis when he talks about taxation. I believe that this insistence of the current government on over-taxation is, please allow me to say this, is a non-effective fixation. And I believe that this over-taxation kills the economy, it kills any way forward to a path of growth. We really need to have incentives, tax incentives, both to attract investments. We need to have tax incentives for companies to employ people. Let's not forget that one of the main problems in Greek society is the very, very high unemployment rate, especially in the young population. And what we have seen up to now is that raising taxes only leads to tax evasion and the exit of Greek companies to neighboring countries which have and provide tax incentives. And then the last thing is the restructuring of the high public debt. And our position, and I believe that this is also the position of the Bank of Greece, is that not only should we see the commitment of our partners in the Eurogroup of 2012, November 2012, materialize, but we should also aim for a revision of the target for a government primary surplus of 3.5% by 2018 onwards to 2% in order for Greece to be able to go back to growth.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to you last. The shipping industry has produced a history of super success. Greek entrepreneurs have been really the marvel of the international business community. And there is a lot of new blood in this industry, I understand. So perhaps you can broach some of these subjects as they're relevant for the future in Greece.
Thank you, John. First of all, let me say I heard so much gloom and doom from economists and politicians, and so much animosity amongst the political class that it is, I don't know whether I should be here. Also, I heard Minister Kefalogiannis listing the priorities, and shipping was the last one. I would have hoped that shipping should be the first one. But before I speak about shipping, please allow me to express my gratitude to my friend Dean Stavridis, Dean Savrakoti, and all the wonderful people who have organized this conference. It's very important. It's been very useful for me. And it has allowed me to come here and express my views about the industry in this very critical moment in our country. I think I have a very easy position in the panel because I will speak about an industry where I really passionately believe, very strongly believe, that it is the most important industry in our country. And I think that it is important not only from the point of view of the impact that it has on the Greek economy in terms of GDP, balance of payments, balance of trade, balance of export services, employment, foreign exchange, direct foreign investment, capital formation. I can go on and on. I have to tell you that I'm not a ship owner of any significance. The significant ship owner here is Mr. Logothetis of Libra Group. I don't know whether he has arrived. and my friend Andrei Vandoros, who is sitting right there. But I have spent all my life trying to finance the industry, both in terms of equity and debt, and trying to navigate the industry to survive in an extremely competitive and fiercely competitive, I would say, and cyclical business. So shipping is important not only for the economic impact, but also for the strategic positioning of this industry, of Greece with this industry. And in my view, our business could serve as a model as we go forward to restructure the country and focus in certain industries in which we have a competitive advantage. I would like to do three things. One is to put the Greek shipping in the context of the global industry. Two, say how important the industry is for the Greek economy. And three, see what it needs to be done going forward. So on the first point, shipping, the global shipping industry is an independent, international, fiercely competitive, specialized, education, special skills needing industry, a global, very competitive industry. In this global industry, which is here to stay, as you know, 90%, over 90% of world trade in bulk, either wet or dry, moves in ships until we discover a better way to transport commodities. It's here to stay. So in this global industry, in this fiercely competitive, capital-intensive, cyclical industry, the Greeks are number one in the world. We are not underdeveloped, we are not developing, we are overdeveloped. We control over 16% of the world fleet by capacity. We are bigger than Japan, we are bigger than China, we are bigger than the United States, we're bigger than the European, any European nation, even the Scandinavians. We control over 40% of the European fleet, and we carry about 20% of the world trade annually, which is about 2 to 2.5 billion tons of cargo per year. Now, we do that without having any substantial imports or exports of our own. And we do it very successfully. So no wonder that you have to remember it is evident how important strategically the industry is for the country. And it is done outside of the Greek administrative and financial structures. Despite Greece's economic problems and its financial dependency, Greek shipping thrives. Despite the slowdown in growth trade in recent years, Greek shipping thrives precisely because it is outside of the Greek structures, financial and administrative. Greek shipping does not burden the Greek balance sheet in terms of debt or equity, and it gets even better. It produces income, which is really 100% export-oriented income, all off-balance sheet. The industry is really an off-balance sheet item. So one wonders, why are we so successful in this business? This is my second point. And the Greeks are so successful in this business and not so successful in other areas of development. And that's a very difficult question to answer, and I think usually people put it on the Greek DNA, whatever that means. You know, we've been at it for 2,500 years, from the Battle of Salamis and Themistocles, for the control of the Aegean, to the independence war against the Ottomans, to the Second World War, I must say, where the Greek fleet contributed significantly in the defeat of Nazism. In fact, the Greek fleet was completely decimated during the war, the transporting goods across the Atlantic. And after the war, the American government, I must say, donated 100 Liberty ships to the Greek shipowners so that they could start again what I consider to be a shipping miracle right after the war. So I think the Greeks are successful in this business because the industry has the characteristics of our people. We are outward looking, we are independent, we are fiercely competitive, we are educated, we like to take risks, we are agile, we are merchants, we are bourgeois. We do not like statism. We cannot thrive in statism. Greeks thrive in freedom. And therefore, if you look around the world where these conditions that I describe exist in all parts of the world, where Greek communities are, with these characteristics, Greeks thrive. And that is a lesson for us and for this meeting as we go ahead. I hear about planning the Greek economy. Okay, I'll finish. Let me very quickly go then to the importance of shipping into for the Greek economy. 5 to 7% of GDP, 15% of trade balance, 290,000 people employed completely in an export industry. The value of the Greek fleet, about 100 billion in US dollars today. A few years ago, it was $200 billion, about 50% today of GDP. $15 billion a year in terms of foreign exchange. In terms of capital formation, in the last 60 years, the Greek ship owners have contributed significantly in capital formation. Hotels, banking, all the Greek shipyards were started by Greek ship owners. All the refineries were started by the Greek ship owners. Significant investments in real estate and hotels. Today I can name almost all the hotels of Greece, or many of them, central hotels, controlled by the Greek ship owners. Going forward, there are three things. Number one is education. Education in terms of guiding our people, our young people, to go to sea, creating trade schools. You know, we have 5,000 ships. If we employ Greeks in every ship, we would make some dent in unemployment. You know, we are not class enemy. We are normal people. We work hard, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days. And we are medium-sized, micro-messes companies that thrive in a fiercely competitive world in a global industry. The second thing that we need is representation. We need our government to represent us in international fora, because we need to maintain in this international fora our competitiveness. The third thing that we must do is we need political and economic stability. It's evident that we need that. Why? Because the Greek owners hold significant liquidities outside the country that they can bring in. They have done it in the past. They can help in promoting capital formation, direct investment. I had the opportunity to meet Minister Houliarakis last night, and I was highly impressed, I must say. He's a young man. He's very well educated. He means well. He is a reformist. Can you please unshackle the Greek industry? Greece? Can you get rid of capital controls? The moment that happens, you will see significant investment in Greece from the owners, Greek ship owners, particularly in supporting the Greek banking system. You talked about declining deposits. Greek liquidity is abroad. And it is abroad because it is petrified to bring its money in. The moment things stabilize, you will see what I described before coming back to the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You certainly reversed this sense of gloom and doom, looking forward, success story, and all that. Let me ask the panelists to take at most 1 minute in making a point, responding, adding, and that would be the beginning. Then when we go to Q&A with the audience, then we come back if necessary. So, John, you want to make a point.
Now let's look forward. Obvious point. If the Greek economy is going to improve, it's got to change. And if the Greek economy is going to remain within the euro area, then the principal agent of change has got to be improvement in productivity, which is going to come about through investment, through education, and through removal of the various kinds of legal and regulatory impediments to initiative and capital formation. So if we want to say what needs to be done to make that happen, I would say, among other things, Lucas Papadimos gave us a very comprehensive list of things that need to be done. But if you want an outside view, the IMF's Article 4 mission, annual review mission, just ended last month. And you can read on the IMF website the concluding statement that provides a rather thorough list of the things that remain to be done, and they're quite challenging. But the notion that adequate change in the Greek economy that would produce notable improvement in productivity, that would produce the economic results we all want to have happen, is a very strenuous one. There's no easy answer, and it is not going to come through external finance. One way or another, it's going to have to be generated domestically.
Do you want to comment? No, or should we move forward? I actually have a question, which is the political uncertainty and instability feed into bad expectations about the future. But the international community has been, I think, so generous. So the question is, why have we failed to translate this readily available assistance into boosting the morale, and even the latest one last year, that the international community stood by and offered further, in my opinion, generous terms. So I think the question is, what do we have to do to reverse these expectations? And let me say that one of the most interesting theories about the Great Depression in the US was that things turn really around when expectations turn around. So the success story that you expounded, I think it's an interesting lesson to think. It has to be, I think, open to the outside, dynamic, competitive, looking at the international economy and the growing areas. So anything you would like, or you have to open the floor? Yes, Lucas.
Perhaps my reading of the response of the international community is slightly different from yours. But having said that, of course, Greece needs to reform, and I can think of a very long list of reforms. But the emphasis I would put would be the reform of the state. Because if I may combine the comments made by the gentleman speaking about shipping, the country essentially has the paradox of having an extremely successful and sizable cosmopolitan elite and a Balkan or Middle Eastern state. And it is this paradox that characterizes the country. So if we want to go through a long list of reforms, the main priority would be the reform of the Greek state. If we do the reforms, then we may also be more credible to ask for our creditors a wider space within to operate in terms of macroeconomic policy and debt sustainability.
I'd just like to go back to saying that the reason why I didn't focus on tourism is that I believe that the Greek economy should not just focus on services. And this is why I put emphasis on all the other sectors of the economy, and I didn't list them in prioritize. I didn't prioritize them. So, of course, we all know that shipping amounts to a very big amount of the GDP. I would like to say that we focus on reforms and privatizations, not only because they're able to help us in attracting investment and create employment, but also I would like to put the element of innovation and the introduction of new technologies, which can help the Greek economy become more competitive. And I believe that in this way we can also improve Greek exports and thus be able to reduce the current account deficit. But the last remark that I would like to make is that one of the problems of Greek political life is that there's no continuation of reforms or positive work that has been done by the previous government or the previous minister. And we have seen this, first of all, in the education reform. Former Minister Arvanitopoulos alluded to this earlier. Greece was able to go ahead with a very big education reform with a very big consensus at the time. And unfortunately, all this was reversed by the current government. We see this also in other fields. I would say that in tourism, we put the grounds for attracting tourism investments and having a spatial law for tourism. And we see that all this has been reversed by the current government, despite the fact that tourism was flourishing and that the dynamic that tourism had during the years of 2013, 2014 have helped tourism even today, and despite the image of the country and the overtaxation of tourism, to be one of the major sectors of the Greek economy. So I believe that one of the elements that we have to focus on is the continuation of reforms and any positive aspects that we see from previous ministers and governments.
Thank you very much. As an educator, I cannot resist, but I cannot resist commenting that the backsliding on education reforms is nothing short of tragic. And moving forward, I think we have to think very carefully, and some of us have been advocating for years, what Mr. Papachelas mentioned, non-profit, private education institutions. And let me turn to the audience. Questions, please identify yourselves when you start asking a question. Any questions from the audience? Yes, back there, please.
Hello, Rockford Whites. I'm with the Fletcher School. I have two hats that are actually relevant for this panel. I'm the director of the Maritime Studies program and also the entrepreneur coach. I wanted to ask about I was very glad to hear all the shipping industry facts. My first introduction to Greece was actually Posidonia, where Andre Vandoros helped me get to all the really great activities there. But I look at the shipping industry globally, and it's in a global recession. And that's probably not going to end, and it's not Greece's fault. It's just a global issue, oversupply and dropping demand from East Asia. Wearing my other hat as entrepreneur coach, I think the entrepreneurial activities and opportunities in Greece are very good. So my question to you is, how does Greece focus on its natural strengths in tourism and shipping, but help those entrepreneurs be very competitive?
Well, good question. Any suggestions? Any volunteers?
2 points at least. One is, one of the encouraging signs of recent years is the rapidly increasing number of young entrepreneurs and startup enterprises in Greece. And that is a positive sign. But you have to fight against 2 obstacles at least. One is shortage, if not non-existence of bank liquidity. I mean, what are the prospects for investment in a country where there is no liquidity to be provided by the financial system? And number 2, still a pretty asphyxiating approach of the state. So I would mention those two obstacles. I could think of a longer list, but for the sake of time, I stop with those two.
Thank you very much. Another question? Dimitri, can I try to get someone else? Yes, Lucas Papadimos, please.
Not a question, a remark, following on some of the points that were made in this panel, but also in the previous one. And looking forward, I want to say a word about how to improve competitiveness, which is crucially important, emphasized also by Pierre and others, for enhancing export performance, and in my mind is a key lever to growth. What has been done and what should be done? First of all, the facts. By now, I think we have fully recovered cost competitiveness as measured by unit labor cost. However, and this is the unfortunate consequence, price competitiveness and structural competitiveness has not improved, but it has improved very little. And this is reflected in the unsatisfactory export performance. Now, why this has happened? I don't think it has been a consequence of the inadequacy of the programs, because the programs did include reforms to enhance both price competitiveness and structural competitiveness. It was a consequence of a failure of implementation. So reforms that were in the second program, and I think they're partly in the third program as well, to increase competition in the product markets, services markets, and goods markets, to make them more free. Although they were there, they were not enacted. Sometimes legislation was passed, but the legislation was not implemented. Last point, looking ahead, and as a consequence of what I have just said, it is crucially important to improve price and structural competitiveness. For price competitiveness, we need to make the markets more competitive, less regulated, more free. But for the structural competitiveness, many more actions are needed in order to improve the range and quality of products. And to do that, we need to enhance entrepreneurship. This can be done by further supporting startups and also for the longer term by improving the education system.
Thank you very much. One last very brief question. Yes, please. Back there. Please make it brief, because we have to adjourn.
Former Fletcher student. Do you honestly, I think Professor Lipsky was actually being particularly diplomatic, but do you really think that with the current government and its intellectual background, you can actually achieve sustainable growth in Greece? Because as someone who's been watching Greece for a very long time, I am extremely skeptical that that's possible.
If the agreed program is implemented fully, it will have very positive results.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.